Better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. So Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 21, verse 9. The relationship between men and women is intriguing. We are attracted to one another, and yet so often there is conflict and fighting, different goals, different hopes. And this is a problem that has continued since God said to Eve, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And so Solomon gives a little bit of advice to a man. Better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. This isn't to say that all women are contentious, but it is not unusual to find women who maybe are frustrated in one way or another and want to argue the toss instead of working together as a team. In the New Testament, Paul presents, on the basis of creation, the fact that a man is to be head of the household. And you have peace in a household when a man takes his responsibility of being responsible for the household, and those members of the household cooperate in that process and don't argue about every little thing that the man chooses to do. This is not to say that the man is necessarily right and the woman is necessarily wrong, or that the woman shouldn't express her opinion about decisions that are made. It's simply a matter of order, that things be done decently in order, and that people agree with an authority structure. Amos says, "Can two walk together unless they are agreed?" Now, it doesn't mean that they have to agree on every detail, but they have to agree to walk together. And that means that they need to agree on some basic things that enable them to get on and to support one another on the journey. And differences need to be resolved. And so in a traditional marriage situation, you have the question, will you go with this man? Will you obey him? And when the woman gives the response, "I will, I do," then you have the marriage pronounced. This question was put to Rebekah when Abraham's servant in Genesis 24 came to seek a wife for Isaac. And the Lord gave signs which suggested that Rebekah was the woman. So the servant was then anxious to take the woman back to Isaac, rather than be delayed a long period of time. And so the question was put to the woman, "Will you go?" And she said yes. She had never met Isaac. She had just known of him and seen the generosity of the gifts that he had sent. But she committed herself to going with that man. It's analogous to when we become a follower of the Lord Jesus. We've never met him before. We only know about him from what we read in the scriptures and are told. But we make the choice to go with him, to accept the invitation to live with him in the Father's house. And then we must complete the journey to actually come to his home. And so Rebekah became Isaac's wife, a key person in God's plan for saving the whole world. The normal situation of a man and a woman living together is, of course, the marriage situation. If there's no marriage there, then one party can leave. But in the marriage situation, you have a contract, until death do us part. Solomon doesn't say better to get a divorce than to share a house with a contentious woman. And he doesn't say better to beat her up into submission than to share a house with a contentious woman. But he does say, dwell in a corner of the housetop. Allow some space, but not too much. Let her have the house, and you go and camp up on the roof for a while. Don't move completely out of the scene, because she needs you, but get out of her hair because you're irritating her. A fascinating piece of advice. I'm not at all suggesting that it's always the woman's fault. We have the story of Abigail and Nabal. He was a violent man, he was a self-centered man, he was a greedy man, and a real trial for those who worked for him, and no doubt a real trial for his wife. But when David and his men, having been good towards Nabal, came seeking food, and he refused to give it, David determined to punish Nabal for his hardness of heart. Abigail, ignoring her husband's wishes, went and took food to David and his men, and took responsibility for it herself, so that judgment wouldn't come and destroy her husband and her life and everything that they had. And consequently, David relented of his attack, and the Lord brought judgment on Nabal, because he was at fault. When we come to the New Testament, there is much said about the marriage situation. Husbands and wives should not separate. The instructions in the Scriptures are for a godly marriage. God invented marriage. He designed it, he established it, and he has planned it for the well-being of society, for the nurture of children. And a happy marriage will be one that is lived according to God's order. And that is, as Paul affirms, Adam was formed first, and Eve was formed from Adam, not to be independent of him, but that the two should work together, but under Adam's headship. But nevertheless, the man is completely dependent on the woman, as the woman is on the man. They are complementary, and they are to come together then to form a strong unity. And so the statement is, the two shall be one. And Solomon in Ecclesiastes celebrates the union of a man and woman and says a threefold cord shall not be broken. What's the third strand? It is, of course, God. And so a godly marriage can survive incredible difficulties, and the unit becomes a very productive unit in society. So Jesus spoke against divorce, saying this was not God's plan from the beginning. It's not an option for a Christian man to divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 says that a married couple should not separate, and if they do, they should plan to get together again. God's blessing is on the marriage, even if only one of them is a believer in the Lord Jesus. Nevertheless, there is recognition that some people do not follow God's law, and so the unbeliever may depart, the one who doesn't follow God's law, in which case the single believer is free to remarry in due course. In Ephesians 5, we have that classic passage on husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it, and wives to submit to their husbands. But the foundation of the submission is the confidence in the love. There is no authority there at all for a husband to beat his wife into submission. He must love his wife into submission. And Peter also has instructions about the relationships between husbands and wives, saying, wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct, accompanied by fear. For in this manner in former times the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, if you do good, and are not afraid with any terror. And husbands, likewise dwell with your wives with understanding, giving honour to the wife, as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Sarah went with her husband on this harebrained scheme that he had to leave Ur in Mesopotamia to go to some unknown place where God was leading him. And when the angels came and spoke to Abraham and she overheard them saying she was going to have a baby, she just burst out laughing. But it happened. She recognized the headship of her husband. She came with him. This is God's plan, that the husband and wife cooperate together. But if there is contention, Solomon didn't say get a divorce. He didn't say beat your wife to submission. Better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman.